to my home about a murder?
Get rid of him.
Let's go, mister.
What's your pitch, Lucy?
I'm going home.
Want to make a statement? The boys tell me I did a couple of murders. Anything in it? I think you better let me have it. Bring in your book.
Everybody loves to talk about movies. Whether they're good movies or bad movies, people love to talk about them. And that's what we're here to do today, to talk about
I
movies.
hadn't been in my office that night when my brain cells playing hide and seek with those dizzy flashes down the street. I'd have never got messed up with a stolen jade
And
necklace.
specifically today, to talk about film noir. My name's Joe Horine. I teach at the University of Cincinnati, and I'm the Associate Director of the Academy for Cinematic Arts. And I'm especially pleased to have my colleague Stan Corkin with me here today because he knows a lot about film noir, and it can be a little bit of a slippery genre to get your arms around and understand. Everyone knows what a musical is. Everyone pretty much knows what a Western is. Film noir is a little dicier. For me, the main attributes of film noir are, well, first of all, it means dark, hence the black clothes for today's show. But more than that, it's about crime and cops, and usually dirty cops. It's about infidelity and adultery often. It can be about murder. The main characters are, in many cases, a femme fatale, a voluptuous or seductive woman that you need to be careful with, and the sort of anti-heroes that are often swayed by the femme fatale. And it grows out of kind of 30s pulp fiction, people like James M. Cain and even Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett to a certain extent. But it's not quite as clean as some genres. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I always think of film noir both as a type of narrative, but also, you know, featuring certain ways of telling the narrative. I always think of it as using a lot of accentuated high and low shots. I always think of it as heavily shadowed lighting, low-key lighting. I think of it as having the voiceover narration. You know, a great example of a film noir for me is a film like Sunset Boulevard, where the story is actually narrated from the perspective of the grave, where you have the William Holden character beginning the movie by lying face down in the swimming pool. A classic noir beginning.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about Double Indemnity as my favorite film noir, but that's another case where you have a voiceover. It's sort of is narrated completely in flashback into a dictaphone of all things to kind of give that Raymond Chandler feeling of the imposing voiceover.
Yeah, and I always think of, you know, when I talk about this and when I'm teaching, I talk about it as kind of having its roots in German Expressionism and the way in which, you know, highly dramatic lighting is used as a means of creating a you know, unnatural look, a horrific look. And Billy Wilder, of course, the director of both Sunset Boulevard and Double Indemnity, is a link to German Expressionism. Worked in the German studios in the 20s as a as a tech before he moved out of Nazi Germany in the 30s and came to Hollywood.
And I think it's an important point that you make there, that there are a lot of European immigrant directors in the film noir space, and that some of the darkness of what was happening in Europe during World War II perhaps contextualizes why this sort of dark, cynical view and that we see in a lot of film noir.
Yeah, and also some of it is kind of the post-war political situation. There's a high instance of noir directors who are around the Hollywood left, who are around the issues of blacklisting and so on.
Yeah. Well, I think the best way to kind of explore film noir is to talk about some of the films specifically. So I'll start by talking about The Maltese Falcon, which was John Huston's directorial debut and really put Humphrey Bogart into the star status. This was a year before he played Rick in Casablanca, but it's often thought to be the first film noir. I don't know if you can really define what was the first one, but it's kind of the hard-boiled detective. He's Sam Spade in this case, and you've got all the touch points of film noir. You've got the femme fatale, you've got his partner's kind of a crooked cop, you've got kind of shady figures in crime.
Tons of emigre actors,
Yeah.
Sidney Greenstreet, Peter Lorre.
Right. Yeah, and the same troupe in the Warner Brothers studio group there that showed up in Casablanca in a lot of ways with him. So that was a great example for me of kind of helping understand what film noir is, The Maltese Falcon in 1941. Night in the City is another one I know you've talked about from 1950.
So that's somewhat later, and it's directed by Jules Dassin. It features Richard Widmark, who's an actor who really comes of age as a figure in noir films, and it was originally supposed to be shot in Hollywood, but after Jules Dassin was blacklisted, the production moved to London. It's a great location shoot, and it's a very kind of arch narrative about a grifter hustler played by Richard Widmark who tries to get into the promotional business of doing wrestling, and it's all about his kind of angles, working the angles in order to kind of go around the mob, and then the massive betrayal that results in his death. So it's a great kind of moralistic drama that uses the noir effects, the low-key lighting, the urban locations, the high-angle and low-angle shots to kind of accentuate the moral bankruptcy of the lack of moral bearings of the world around him.
Right, right. One that's probably my favorite film noir, as I mentioned before, when we were talking about Billy Wilder, is his film Double Indemnity from 1944. The femme fatale there is a great performance by Barbara Stanwyck, who at the time was the highest paid actress and therefore probably the highest paid female in the country at the time. And she's brilliant in her role of Phyllis, the kind of the conniving woman who's encourages Fred McMurray, playing a little bit out of type as an insurance agent who's sort of duped into to murdering her husband for the money, similar to The Postman Always Rings Twice, and from a plot standpoint, which is also from a James M. Cain novel. And the interesting thing to me there is Edward G. Robinson plays the character Keyes.
Great role.
It's more of a love story, I think, between Fred McMurray and Edward G. Robinson's character than it is
a tortured love story.
Yeah, tortured love story between this insurance agent and his mentor, and he kind of has to explain what he did to his father figure almost. And it's a strange movie, but a very interesting movie. It's got a lot of the shadows and spiderweb kind of prison bar images, the deep dark black and white photography.
So I think Wilder kind of codifies what's going to become the noir. So, the title of noir doesn't really occur until the later 50s through the devices of French critics. So noir directors didn't really know they were making noirs, but this Double Indemnity is a highly influential film, and arguably it creates the kind of look of noir, the shadows, the angles, but also the kind of classic vision of shooting through shooting through Venetian blinds,
right,
and having the kind of modeled lighting that you find in noir scenes. It's really a film that knows very much how it wants to make its effects.
Yeah, absolutely. When we come back, we'll go through our list and a flash round of all of our favorite film noir efforts. We'll see you then.
There's one thing we could do that would fix everything for us.
What? Pray for something to happen to Nick?
Something like that.
Cora.
Well, you suggested it yourself once, didn't you?
I was only joking.
Were you?
Yes, I was.
Hi, welcome back. This is Joe Horine with Stan Corkin, and we're talking about movies today. We're talking about film noir movies, and we're going to go through kind of a flash round of some of our favorite picks, the Mount Rushmore or the Mount Rush Noir, perhaps, of our favorite noir films of all time. Why don't you start with Out of the Past from 1947?
So Out of the Past is a great pulp movie about a gambler who disappears and then kind of re-insinuates himself into the underworld that he's left. Robert Mitchum, in many ways, is a great cynical noir figure who kind of naturally plays the moral ambiguity that's so much a central part of films noir.
Yeah, that's a great one. And another one that comes to mind for me is The Big Sleep from 1946. Talked a little bit about the Maltese Falcon in the first segment where Humphrey Bogart plays Sam Spade. He plays Philip Marlowe in this one. And one of the things that's notable here is that it's one of the, I think it's the second team up with Lauren Bacall. They kind of became a famous duo. To Have and to Have Not, I believe, was their first film together. This was the second. And one of the things I like about it, it's based on on a Raymond Chandler novel. One of the screenwriters is William Faulkner. And it's a very confusing sort of flip-floppy plot. And at one point, they asked Chandler. Faulkner might have been the one who asked Chandler, "Now, who killed the chauffeur?" And Chandler goes, "I'm not even sure myself." So it's so confusing that the author wasn't even sure, but that's kind of the fun of it. It's a typical sort of detective mystery with a lot of the deep shadows that we know to appreciate from film noir.
I mean, that's one of the things about film noir is that it doesn't really matter if the plot makes sense. It's all about the atmospherics.
Yeah.
So in ways that, that becomes emblematic of, the shaggy dog murder mystery that's at the center that we're never going to solve.
Right. Another one that I know you like is the Body and Soul from 1947 as well.
So I'm a big John Garfield fan, and Body and Soul, directed by Robert Rossen, who would again go on to be blacklisted, but then would also made All the King's Men in 1950, just before he was enjoined from working in Hollywood for a generation. But then did The Hustler, and you can kind of see the continuities among those films. So Body and Soul is a very cynical film about a boxer who's used up by the mob for his body. Great secondary role by the African-American actor Canada Lee, who plays a boxer who's the generation before the John Garfield character, who's already been used up and who's somewhat punch drunk. So it's really a film that people don't watch much anymore, and it's a very gritty and very moving mid-40s film.
Yeah. Out of that boxing genre, there are some pretty good movies that follow.
Well, there are. I mean, a lot of noirs are boxing movies.
Yeah.
The Champion is also a great example with Kirk Douglas.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about Stanley Kubrick next, and one of his early films, right before he kind of made it big, was a boxing film. But the one I'm going to talk about is Kubrick's film The Killing from the late 50s, and it falls into that genre of heist films. Stars Sterling Hayden, who also is in the Asphalt Jungle, John Huston's film, another great heist movie. The Killing's about Kubrick's film. The Killing's about a robbery of a horse race track. With a team of robbers and crooks that fit into that noir genre. Very much Lucien Ballard was the photographer for that, and Kubrick and Ballard argued a lot, but because Kubrick had a very specific look he wanted for that, and Ballard kind of pushed back from the traditional Hollywood perspective. But ultimately, Kubrick won out, and Quentin Tarantino claims that The Killing is one of his inspirations for Reservoir Dogs, his heist film, jewelry heist film.
I can see it.
So there's a lot of good stuff that you can see coming later for Kubrick in his probably purest film noir, The Killing. 1948's Force of Evil was one on your list.
So Force of Evil is also, so Abe Polonsky wrote the screenplay for Body and Soul, and then he was allowed to direct Force of Evil. Force of Evil is, and again, Abraham Polonsky is one of the blacklisted writer-directors of the 50s. So Polonsky had a vision of making this metaphoric critique of American capitalism. starring John Garfield, and it's featuring Thomas Lopez, and it's about a working class based lawyer who comes to work for a white shoe firm in Manhattan and decides he's going to corner the numbers game and create a huge payoff for himself and for his brother, who has a small candy store and numbers racket also in Brooklyn. And it's a great cynical film in which John Garfield's brother, played by Thomas Lopez, eventually is killed by the mob, and it has this, kind of moral resolution at the end where John Garfield's walking down the steps to that are at the base of the George Washington Bridge, looking for the corpse of his brother and resolving to clean up the immorality that exists in New York City and in organized crime. The joke is, of course, that he didn't get to clean up anything because he didn't make another movie until Tell Them Willie Boy Is Here in 1966, starring Robert Blake. And so that, but this is a kind of cast aside. It's a great film noir, again, very self-aware of the mood and the tone and the lighting, and using John Garfield to great effect in the course of the film.
Gotcha. Yeah. Force of Evil has a very similar title to one on my list, which is Touch of Evil, based on the novel Badge of Evil. But it's part of the Orson Welles canon of noir films. He wasn't specifically a noir director, although Citizen Kane and the photography of Greg Toland, I think, really established kind of that deep focus look. And a lot of the shadows and the use of the camera that became...
Also indebted to Expressionism.
Yeah, exactly. German Expressionism definitely factors into Citizen Kane. And then a couple years later, he made The Lady of Shanghai, right, with his then wife, or maybe recently estranged wife.
I think, right. Maybe they were husband and wife at the beginning, but not at
right,
the end.
Not at the end of the film. The Lady from Shanghai with Rita Hayworth. But Touch of Evil in the late 50s is one of those films that sort of stands out as sort of late classical noir before it moved into a new phase. I think it was maybe 1958, and a little bit of, like Citizen Kane, maybe a little bit of autobiography with Orson Welles on Touch of Evil, about sort of a man who'd gotten rather rotund and sort of past his prime, perhaps, but still cranking out work.
So one of the things I think about when I see A Touch of Evil is the way in which Orson Welles' career floundered in Hollywood.
Yeah.
And what it does is it allows, there's a distinction in the late 40s and 50s between movies and films.
Right.
And A Touch of Evil is very much a film.
Right.
So that one of the things that noir did is worked very effectively with low budgets.
Right.
Because it could create, first of all, it was often in black and white. And second of all, it would create its kind of nuances, not through large production, but actually through subtleties of staging. Mm-hmm. And, so A Touch of Evil worked in both within the Orson Welles universe of what he liked to do with his mise en scene, but it also worked within his ability to garner a budget, which in this case was not to garner a great budget.
Right, right. When we come back for the third segment, we'll talk a little bit more about film noir.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I watched sea beams glitter in the dark near the 10-house gate. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain.
Hi, we're back talking about movies. Joe Horine here with Stan Corkin talking about film noir today. One of the things that my students at least say is, first of all, they prefer to watch color movies as opposed to black and white movies. But they always say, well, can it be a film noir movie if it's in color? And I think with a few examples, the answer is probably yes. But we'll see what you think. I mean, Pulp Fiction is Quentin Tarantino's movie from 1994 that certainly has recollections back to the 1930s Pulp Fiction that a lot of the 40s noir movies were based on. It has, criminals and, infidelity and all those things that we talked about.
Boxing.
It has boxing in it, exactly. So, what do you think? Would you call Pulp Fiction a film noir?
So I would, I'd introduce the category, not of my own making, of neo-noir.
Right.
So that I think that noir films, people often talk about A Touch of Evil is the last film noir.
Right.
And I think that that's to some degree true. You could probably argue for noir elements of other black and white films from the early 60s. But I think once you get to the late 60s, you're out of the noir period, and what you're doing is working with generally a bunch of directors who are either film school trained or film buffs, and they're trying to replicate, using the materials that are current to them, elements of the noir form. And so I think that, they're not pure noirs. They really couldn't be, but they are, and probably the closest to a pure noir of any of these films is by the very self-aware Coen brothers in Blood Simple, where they use Emmett Walsh as a kind of noir prototype. But I think that the category of neo-noir works very well, and it works very well for the many color kind of takeoffs on film noir.
Yeah, I would put in the neo-noir category the 1981 film Body Heat as well, which is pretty close a remake of Double Indemnity.
Right.
Lawrence Kasdan had written Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Empire Strikes Back, and had gotten the job to direct his first film, and he loved noir. He loved a lot of the movies we've already talked about, and so he kind of hired some fairly unknown actors at the time, William Hurt and Kathleen Turner, to do a remake of kind of an insurance scandal with William Hurt as a rather ethically spurious lawyer. And it's very, very sexy and very sultry, and it sort of replaces that black and white with heat, the first line, the last line. It's kind of swarmy heat the whole way through. And I think it works as a noir.
I think so too, and I think that his use of noirish atmospherics in the music, Bernard Herrmann type music.
By John Barry.
Right, so again, very, very effective. So that's a great example of a film school trained director quoting extensively, and in this case, largely replicating in ways much like the Coen brothers, but with a bigger budget and an even more self-aware sense of the atmospherics.
Yeah, another one that comes up a lot is Chinatown from 1974, Roman Polanski's film. It has a lot of those elements of noir, but it doesn't really have a femme fatale. I mean, Faye Dunaway ultimately seems like she might be, but isn't quite, but certainly has that feel. Again, the music has that very kind of 40s smoky sort of feel to it. So I'm kind of on the fence about Chinatown as film noir.
So it's certainly noir-ish. And the whole conceit of Chinatown and the final scene with the shootout in Chinatown is very noir. I also think that the character of Jake is a very noir character, and all you have to do is sit in his office and see the sun stream through his Venetian blinds to know that Roman Polanski wants to invoke film noir. But I agree that there are many things that don't exactly work. I think the absence of a femme fatale. I actually think the kind of peripheral characters are very noir. The Burt Young, Roman Polanski playing the gangster. Those really are evocative of 40s films. But it's something of a hybrid. But to know noir is to have a better appreciation of what Polanski's trying to do and what he's trying to do differently.
Right. We've talked a couple times about the Coen brothers, and maybe that catapults us into a discussion about where is this genre today. I mean, obviously Blood Simple is where they started. Fargo was the kind of in the middle of their career, or fairly early still, and then a little bit after Fargo, The Man Who Wasn't There. Almost slipped into Hitchcock mode there. But The Man Who Wasn't There is Billy Bob Thornton in black and white. Very obvious homage to film noir. So are the Coen brothers representative of that this genre is alive and kicking, or?
I think that this is more alive than Westerns. Yeah. Because it is a type of film that people gravitate to. That's because its generic markers are more formal than narrative based. Then it's something that is more easily transferable to a different period. And I think that film students love film noir, and they love to evoke film noir. And I think that that kind of, the way you can play with it as, you know, because it's sort of a genre, sort of not a genre, I think that it maintains, it's easier to maintain as a vital type of filmmaking, and we see its effects in any number of contemporary films.
I mean, you mentioned westerns. So you have these two genres, westerns and film noir, that some would argue are really the only two indigenous American genres. As a film historian, gangster film also.
And the gangster film does overlap with the noir, certainly.
Yeah, but as a film historian, do you feel that's an accurate statement to say that those two are the most?
Well, certainly the western is the most American of all genres, and I think that the, you know, I would say that noir is kind of a form that's, you know, that's been an important American form, but actually it has many influences from without, so that it's a synthesis. And as it's actuated in America, it kind of is a good kind of metaphor for the relationship between Hollywood and other international film movements. So not only do we find German expressionism in film noir, but we can see Italian neorealism.
Right.
It was very important as a kind of feedback loop with the French New Wave. Mm-hmm. So films like Shoot the Piano Player are French reenactments of American films noir. Mm-hmm. So it is kind of a meeting point between U.S. filmmaking and international filmmaking. Even a film like Once Upon a Time in America, Leone really works with noir and American gangster films to create something fresh through his Italian prism, which, you know, again, is a kind of meta-commentary on American filmmaking.
Absolutely. Well, Stan, thank you for joining me.
Thank
this
you
was
very
very
much,
insightful, as usual.
Doing it.
And with that, we'll go dark on Film Noir, and we'll see you next time.
Some smart cop might even connect this burglary with your release. Well, there you are. Of course, as I said, it's up to you. You can keep in touch with me through Cobby.
You did a great job, Emmerich, but it's not working.
Bob!
Back away and keep out of this, Emmerich. Now you, Farmer, get your hands up. And you, Fritz, throw the bag on the floor. Over here by my feet. Be careful how you throw it. I got a pistol expert medal.
What do you say, Dix?